If you're a typical gardener, you spend a lot of time deciding what varieties and what plants you're going to grow in your garden, and that's a good thing. But how much time do you spend on deciding what not to grow? Because that's a good thing too. Join me today as I discuss 10 crops that I'm not growing in my garden this year. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and this year I've taken a lot of time trying to decide what not to grow in my garden because I've been spending a lot of time deciding what I'm going to grow. And some of the things I'm doing this year will be different than what I've done in the past. I'm planning on growing a lot of peppers this year. I'm planning on growing a lot of tomatoes this year. And I want to devote more space in my garden to those crops in particular. That means something has to go because space is a big factor when deciding what to grow or what not to grow. I'm also growing a lot of garlic this year. That bed and this bed are already planted with garlic. That's twice the amount I normally use. So before I even start my regular summer garden, I'm one bed short from where I normally am. So what was growing in this bed last year that I'm going to cut out? Yellow squash. And I've made videos before where I talk about yellow squash being my favorite squash. I always grow it. But this year, especially since I no longer have a bed to grow it, I'm not going to grow it. It's one of those plants that doesn't take a lot of room. It's very prolific, and depending on how you fix it, it's pretty tasty. I still have yellow squash in my basement from last year's garden. With just a couple plants, I had more than 40 pounds of yellow squash. And I'm getting a little tired of it. That's one reason. Another reason is I'm moving into a new realm with my squashes. I'm going to be growing a delicata squash this year, and I want to save the seeds from that plant. If I'm growing yellow squash, maybe in that bed, because that's where I have the space, and I'm growing the delicata as well, there's the possibility of cross-pollination. So, to avoid that issue, I'm just going to leave out the yellow squash completely. Saves me room, I'm a little bored with it, and I don't have to worry about cross-pollination with the squash plants that I am growing. Another crop I'm not growing this year is turnips. Now, a primary reason why I grow turnips is as a trap crop. I'll grow some turnips in that bed and over there and intersperse them throughout the garden as a magnet for some of those insect pests that come to the garden. Because the pests I have in my area tend to like turnips. So the turnips are a sacrificial plant that I'll give to the pests that show up. Last year, I didn't have a lot of pests show up because of the way I garden with diversity, encouraging the beneficial insects and the birds. I'm already seeing a reduction in the harmful pests in my garden. So this year, I'm not going to grow turnips as a trap crop to see how that impacts the pests that do show up in my garden. Most of the turnips I grew stayed through the whole season to serve that purpose. Occasionally, I would dig them up and roast them along with beets and onions and potatoes, but not this year. Hopefully, the pests won't even notice. Last year, I grew tomatillos in this bed, and I had limited success with them. I had grand aspirations of growing the tomatillos and adding them to my salsas, but they just didn't do as well as I had hoped. I've grown tomatillos in the greenhouse before, and I've grown them outside. They take a lot of space. And while I could grow them again this year and devote the time and energy and space to the tomatillos, last year, because my harvest was so small, I recognized it's not one of my favorite plants, and I really don't use it as much as I think I will. So rather than devoting half of a bed like I did last year to tomatillos, I'm going to use that space for one of those other plants, like the tomatoes or the peppers, or maybe extra pickling cucumbers. Tomatillos are nice to grow in a garden, but not for me, and not this year. The next crop I'm not growing is kale. Now, I like kale. I'm not a huge fan, but I've grown kale in that bed, and this bed, and this bed, and that bed in recent years. And while I used it in some of my salads, and I made kale chips, which is a wonderful snack, most of my kale went unused. So it's another one of those plants that's easy to grow, doesn't take up a lot of space, but if you're not going to use it, why grow it? I still want some kale in my diet, but this year I'll grow a few plants in my green stock and not use the space in my garden. Many of us have gardening challenges. In my Colorado garden, I have a short growing season during the summer. It's very hot, it's very dry. We've been encountering drought conditions for a number of years, so I have to be aware of how much water I'm using. And when it comes to plants like melons, it just doesn't fit with this region. I've tried growing melons for years and had limited success. I've tried choosing varieties that can grow in a region like mine, like the Minnesota midget, but the time it takes and the space it takes and the water it takes to grow melons just isn't worth the few that I usually end up harvesting. And the taste just doesn't compare to what I can get at the local farmer's market. I know, I hate to say that, but for me, in this garden, melons aren't going to have a place this year. Another reason for not growing a plant is that you just get bored with it. And that's why this year I'm not growing Swiss chard. I've grown it for years and years and years, but I'm just bored with Swiss chard. Last year I grew it in all 3 of these beds, and it survived all season long in these 3 beds because I just got tired of fixing it. So I'm giving myself a break this year because I do like chard and I would like to grow it again, but just not this year. So if there's something you're just getting tired of, give yourself a break. Don't grow Swiss chard if it falls into that category. This year I'm also cutting back on eggplant. Now, I didn't grow up eating eggplant. I think I may be the only one in my entire extended family that eats eggplant, but I started growing it and had good success with it. The last year, these 2 beds gave me a lot of eggplant because it does well in my garden. But I literally couldn't give it away because most of the people I know don't eat eggplant. So this is one of those plants I was growing because I had success with it. And ultimately, it took a while to recognize that it really wasn't worth growing because I wasn't using it. This year, even though it is highly successful in my garden, eggplant won't have a place in it. A crop that many of you are probably growing that I won't is broccoli. Now, I've never been a big fan of broccoli. It does okay in my region, or I should say, it historically has done well in my region because in the last couple years we've had such hot weather show up so early that the broccoli bolts before I can get a good harvest. Anticipating that we may have those early heat waves, I'm just going to avoid it completely this year. I usually grow the turnips as a trap crop because the pests like the broccoli. Because I'm not growing the turnips this year, there is a slightly increased possibility that the brassicas, like the broccoli, might be more susceptible to those pests. So when you throw in pests and bolting and the fact that it's not one of my favorite things to eat, I'm just not going to spend the time growing it. I'm not growing potatoes in my garden this year. Potatoes are one of those crops that I typically grow every 2 or 3 years. I don't grow potatoes every single year. This year I was debating on whether I would grow potatoes and whether I would grow them in the grow bags or grow them in the beds and which varieties I would grow. And by the time I got around to actually ordering potatoes, some of the ones that I wanted to grow were already out of stock in the nurseries that I get my potatoes from. So I went to other nurseries, chose different varieties, and I was just too late in ordering. So that's a big reason why potatoes are not going in my garden this year. I just waited too long to decide whether I was going to grow them or not. And so it's relatively easy to just say, okay, I don't need to try anymore. I'll save those grow bags and save those beds for something else. And then next year, maybe I'll be ahead of the game and plan my ordering sooner so it's not an issue. Another crop that I grow pretty much every year just because it's so easy are radishes, but not this year. Radishes don't take a lot of time to grow, and they don't take a lot of energy from the point of the gardener to make them grow, but they do take space. It's one of those things that I like adding to my salad, but if I don't have a radish in the salad, it's no big deal. There really aren't a lot of nutrients. They're empty calories. So for growing as a food crop, radishes don't have a lot to offer other than a little bit of extra taste to it. Next year, I think I'll grow some radishes and maybe pickle them, but this year, it's another one of those plants that I'm taking a break from. You can see that the reasons for not growing a crop pretty much parallel the reasons for why you can grow a crop. How much space can you devote to it? How much water do you have? Is it something that fits your diet? Are there pests that might attack that crop in particular when compared with others? Is it something that takes extra effort and time to grow in your garden? When you start looking at those kind of factors into choosing what to grow, also use those factors when deciding what not to grow. And so with those thoughts, let me know, what are you not growing this year that maybe you were growing in the past? And why? Does it fit some of the same reasoning that I've used? I'm guessing it does. If you're interested in how I do choose the crops that I grow, well then watch one of these videos next. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.